The howling wind carried more than just dust and tumbleweed across the barren plains of Wyoming Territory that bitter November evening in 1873. It carried the desperate prayers of Nora Gallagher as she clung to the reins of her exhausted mare, squinting through the growing darkness at what appeared to be the faint glow of a lantern in the distance. Nora's fingers had long since gone numb from the cold, her thin coat providing little protection against the harsh elements. The journey from St. Louis had depleted her funds and her strength, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back, a small leather satchel containing her few possessions, and a heart full of determination to escape the life she'd left behind. "Just a little further, Penny," she whispered to the mare, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I think there's shelter ahead." The homestead appeared gradually through the swirling snow, a modest cabin with a small barn and corral nestled against a backdrop of pine trees. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth within. Nora felt a surge of hope as she guided Penny toward the property. As she approached, a tall figure emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. The man moved with caution, his stance wary as he watched her approach. "That's far enough," he called out, his deep voice carrying across the yard. "State your business." Nora raised her hands slightly to show she meant no harm. "Please, sir, I'm in need of shelter for the night. The storm caught me by surprise and my horse is nearly spent." The man stepped closer, lowering his rifle slightly. The lantern light revealed a face weathered by sun and hardship, with striking blue eyes that studied her with suspicion. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat, and several days' worth of stubble on his strong jaw. "You're a long way from anywhere, miss," he said, his voice softening as he noticed her trembling form. "Where are you headed?" "Jackson," Nora replied, though in truth, she had no specific destination in mind beyond putting distance between herself and St. Louis. The man glanced at the darkening sky. "Jackson's still 2 days' ride, and this storm isn't letting up anytime soon." He seemed to consider for a moment before nodding toward the barn. "You can stable your horse for the night. I've got room on the floor by the fire." Relief flooded through Nora. "Thank you. I'm Nora Gallagher." "Zachary Vaughn," he replied, taking Penny's reins to lead her toward the barn. "Most folks just call me Zach." Nora followed him, stumbling slightly as her legs, stiff from hours in the saddle, struggled to support her. Zach noticed and reached out a strong hand to steady her. "You're half frozen," he observed, his brow furrowing with concern. "Let's get you inside after we tend to your mare." Together, they unsaddled Penny and made sure she had hay and water. Nora stroked the mare's nose gratefully, aware of Zach's eyes on her as he assessed her condition. "You're traveling alone?" he asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Nora nodded, unwilling to elaborate. Her reasons for leaving St. Louis were her own, and she wasn't ready to share them with a stranger, no matter how kind. Zach didn't press for details. "Come on, then. The cabin's not much, but it's warm." The interior of Zach's home was indeed modest, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and various supplies organized neatly along the walls. A cast-iron stove occupied another corner, with a coffee pot simmering atop it. "Sit by the fire," Zach instructed, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. "I'll pour you some coffee. It'll help warm you from the inside." Nora sank gratefully onto a chair near the hearth, extending her hands toward the flames. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Vaughn." "I promise I'll be on my way as soon as the weather permits." Zach handed her a steaming cup. "Just Zach is fine, and you're welcome to stay until the storm passes. It's no trouble." As Nora sipped the strong, black coffee, she studied her host. Despite his initial wariness, there was a gentleness to his movements and a kindness in his eyes that put her at ease. His cabin, though simple, was clean and well-maintained, the home of a man who took pride in what little he had. "Are you hungry?" he asked, moving to the stove. "I've got stew that needs eating." Nora's stomach growled in response, and she felt a blush creep into her cheeks. That would be wonderful, thank you. While Zach prepared their meal, Nora's gaze wandered around the cabin, noting the small details: a shelf of worn books, a guitar in the corner, a faded photograph on the mantel. Her curiosity piqued at the signs of refinement in this frontier dwelling. "You live out here alone?" she asked as he placed a bowl of fragrant stew before her. Zach nodded, taking the seat opposite her. "Just me and the cattle. Been working this land for 5 years now. It's quite remote." "That's part of why I chose it," he replied with a half smile. "I wanted space to build something of my own, away from too many prying eyes." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the howling wind outside making the warmth of the cabin feel even more precious. As Nora's body temperature normalized and her hunger abated, exhaustion began to overtake her. Zach noticed her drooping eyelids. "You take the bed," he said, rising to gather some blankets from a trunk. "I'll make up a place for myself here by the fire." "Oh, I couldn't possibly, I insist," he interrupted. "You've had a hard journey and there's no telling how long this storm will last. You need proper rest." Too tired to argue further, Nora accepted his offer with gratitude. After he'd turned his back to give her privacy, she removed only her boots before slipping beneath the woolen blankets, still fully clothed. The bed smelled of pine and soap clean, masculine scents that were oddly comforting. From across the room, Zach banked the fire for the night. "Sleep well, Miss Gallagher," he said softly. "Thank you, Zach," she murmured, already drifting into the deepest sleep she'd had in weeks. When Nora awoke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the cabin's small window, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. She sat up, momentarily disoriented, before remembering where she was and who had given her shelter. Zach stood at the stove, his back to her. He had already dressed for the day in a clean shirt and work pants, his hair damp as though he'd recently washed. "Good morning," she said, smoothing her rumpled clothing as best she could. He turned, offering her a warm smile that transformed his rugged features. "Good morning. Thought you might sleep till noon the way you were snoring." Nora's hand flew to her mouth in embarrassment. "I wasn't." His laugh was rich and genuine. "No, you weren't, but you sure slept sound." He nodded toward a basin of water he'd placed on the table. "Thought you might want to freshen up before breakfast." Grateful for his thoughtfulness, Nora used the cold water to wash her face and hands, combing her fingers through her tangled auburn hair as best she could. "The storm's passed," Zach informed her as he served up plates of bacon, eggs, and biscuits. "But there's a good foot of snow on the ground. Your mare needs rest, and the trails will be treacherous for a day or two." Nora's heart sank. She had hoped to continue her journey, though she had to admit the prospect of another day in this warm cabin with its kind owner wasn't entirely unwelcome. "I wouldn't want to impose further," she said, even as she gratefully accepted the plate he offered. Zach shook his head. "It's no imposition. Truth be told, it's nice having company." He hesitated, then added, "I could use some help with chores if you're willing." "Consider it payment for your stay." The idea of being useful rather than simply accepting charity appealed to Nora. "Of course, I'm stronger than I look, and I'm no stranger to hard work." After breakfast, bundled in an extra coat Zach lent her, Nora followed him outside to begin the day's tasks. The Wyoming landscape spread before them, transformed by the fresh snow into a dazzling white expanse under a clear blue sky. The beauty of it momentarily took her breath away. "It's magnificent," she murmured. Zach paused beside her, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "It can be harsh, but yes, it has its moments." He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Come on, we need to check on the cattle first." For the next few hours, Nora worked alongside Zach, helping to feed the small herd of cattle he kept in a sheltered valley not far from the cabin. She learned that he had started with just 3 cows, and had slowly built his herd to 20 head, with hopes of expanding further in the coming years. "It's not much compared to some of the big ranches," he admitted as they trudged back toward the cabin for midday meal. But it's mine, free and clear. You should be proud, Nora told him sincerely. Building something from nothing takes courage and determination. He looked pleased at her words, a slight flush coloring his cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. What about you? What brought you out this way all alone? The direct question caught Nora off guard. She had been enjoying their companionable work, the physical exertion helping to clear her mind of the troubles that had driven her west. I needed a fresh start, she said finally, deciding that a partial truth was better than an outright lie. St. Louis held too many painful memories. Zach studied her face for a moment, then nodded, seeming to understand that there was more to the story but respecting her reticence. The West is good for fresh starts. No one asks too many questions about who you were before. They continued their chores throughout the afternoon, with Zach teaching Nora about the various aspects of ranch life. Despite her city upbringing, she proved a quick learner, eager to contribute and genuinely interested in his way of life. As the sun began to set, turning the snow-covered landscape golden, they returned to the cabin, both tired but satisfied with the day's work. "You're quite the ranch hand, Nora Gallagher," Zach remarked as they stomped the snow from their boots. "You sure you haven't done this before?" Nora laughed, enjoying the way her name sounded in his deep voice. "Quite sure, but I appreciate the compliment." That evening, after a hearty meal of venison stew that they prepared together, they sat by the fire, the companionable silence occasionally broken by conversation. Nora found herself drawn to Zach's quiet strength and unassuming intelligence. He spoke of his dreams for the ranch, his voice coming alive with passion as he described his plans for breeding better cattle and expanding his land holdings. "What about you?" he asked, poking at the fire with an iron. "What are your plans once you reach Jackson?" Nora stared into the flames, considering her answer. The truth was, she had no specific plans beyond escaping her past. "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted. "Find work, I suppose. I'm good with numbers and correspondence." "Perhaps a position as a clerk or bookkeeper." "Educated then," Zach observed with a nod. "That explains the way you talk," she smiled ruefully. "My father believed in education for his daughters as well as his sons. Not everyone approved, but he was quite progressive in that regard." "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," Nora said softly, the grief of his loss still fresh even after 2 years. "He taught me that a woman's mind is just as valuable as a man's." "I'd say he was right about that," Zach agreed. He hesitated, then asked, "Your family? They're not looking for you, are they? I mean, you're not running from people who care about you." The question was asked with such gentle concern that Nora felt compelled to offer more of the truth. "My parents are both gone. My brother." She swallowed hard. "My brother died in a riverboat accident last year. There's no one looking for me, Zach. No one who truly cares where I am." The sadness in her voice must have been evident, for Zach reached across the space between them and briefly squeezed her hand. "I'm sorry for your losses." The warmth of his calloused hand on hers sent an unexpected flutter through Nora's chest. She withdrew gently, suddenly aware of the intimacy of their situation alone together in this remote cabin, sharing confidences by firelight. "Thank you," she said, rising from her chair. "I should probably turn in. Another day of ranch work tomorrow, I presume," Zach nodded, standing as well. "If you're willing. The trail to Jackson should be passable by tomorrow afternoon, though." There was a question in his statement, an unspoken offer for her to stay longer if she wished. Nora found herself surprisingly tempted by the idea, but caution prevailed. "I should continue my journey as planned," she said, though with less conviction than she intended. That night, as she lay in Zach's bed listening to his steady breathing from his makeshift bed by the fire, Nora reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this place. One night of shelter had turned into 2, and in that brief time, she had glimpsed a life so different from her own, simpler in some ways, harder in others, but undeniably appealing in its honesty and purpose. Zach Vaughn was unlike any man she had ever met. There was a solidity to him, a groundedness that contrasted sharply with the smooth, talking businessmen and society gentlemen she had known in St. Louis. He was a man who worked with his hands, who built rather than inherited, who faced the harshness of nature daily and emerged stronger for it. And he was handsome, she admitted to herself, in a rugged, unpolished way that she found unexpectedly attractive. But Nora knew better than to let such thoughts take root. She had come west to escape, to rebuild her life on her own terms, not to fall into dependence on another person, no matter how kind or appealing. Tomorrow, she would thank Zach for his hospitality, Mount Penny, and continue on her way to Jackson and whatever future awaited her there. With that resolution firmly in mind, she drifted into sleep. The morning dawned clear and bright, the snow beginning to melt under the Wyoming sun. After a breakfast of flapjacks and coffee, Nora helped Zach with the morning chores, working with a quiet efficiency that belied her city upbringing. As they made their way back to the cabin around midday, Zach paused, shading his eyes to look toward the horizon. "Riders coming," he said, his posture suddenly alert. "3 of them." Nora followed his gaze, anxiety prickling along her spine. "Is that unusual, out here?" "Yes." He turned to her, his expression serious. "Stay close to me. Probably nothing to worry about, but best to be cautious." They waited as the riders approached, 3 men bundled against the cold, their horses kicking up plumes of snow as they cantered toward the cabin. Zach's hand rested near the pistol at his hip, though his stance remained casual. As the men drew closer, Nora could make out their features rough-looking individuals with the hard eyes of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. The leader, a heavy-set man with a bushy beard, reined in his horse a few yards from where they stood. "Afternoon," he called out, his gaze sliding from Zach to Nora with an interest that made her skin crawl. "Fine day after that storm, ain't it?" "Can be," Zach replied neutrally. "Something I can help you gentlemen with?" The bearded man smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Just passing through, friend, heading to Jackson. Thought we might rest our horses for a spell, maybe warm up a bit." Zach's expression remained impassive. "You're welcome to water your horses at the trough. I've got coffee brewing inside if you're in need of warming up." The offer seemed to surprise the riders, who exchanged glances before the leader nodded. "Much obliged." As they dismounted, Nora noticed that all 3 men wore revolvers, and one carried a rifle in a scabbard on his saddle. She stepped slightly closer to Zach, drawing comfort from his solid presence. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was tense as the men warmed themselves by the fire, clutching cups of the coffee Zach had provided. They introduced themselves as Hank, Boyd, and Wesley, offering no surnames and little information about their business. "Your wife makes a fine cup of coffee," Hank, the bearded leader, remarked, nodding toward Nora, who stood near the stove. Before Nora could correct him, Zach spoke. "My wife knows her way around a kitchen, that's certain." Nora shot him a startled glance, but quickly composed her features, understanding his strategy. A married woman would be less of a target for these rough men than a single female traveler. "How long you folks been out here?" Boyd, the youngest of the 3, asked. 5 years on the ranch," Zach answered smoothly. "Nora joined me about a year ago." "Must get lonely," Wesley commented, his eyes lingering on Nora in a way that made her uncomfortable. "We keep busy," Zach replied, moving subtly to position himself between Nora and the men. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with the visitors asking questions about the area, nearby ranches, and the quickest route to Jackson. Throughout, Nora noticed Zach providing information that was helpful but vague, never revealing too much about his own operation or neighbors. Finally, Hank drained his cup and stood. "Well, we appreciate the hospitality, but we'd best be moving on if we want to make decent progress before nightfall." Relief flooded through Nora as the men prepared to depart. Zach walked them out to their horses, while she remained in the doorway of the cabin watching the exchange. As they mounted up, Hank turned to Zach with a grin. "You've got yourself a fine place here, friend, and a pretty wife too. Man could envy you." I count my blessings, Zach replied evenly. The riders departed at a leisurely pace, occasionally glancing back until they disappeared over a rise in the land. Only then did Zach's shoulders relax, though his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. You think they'll come back? Nora asked quietly, joining him in the yard. Zach turned to her, his expression grim. I don't know, something wasn't right about them, too interested in details about the area, about neighboring ranches. Rustlers? Possibly, or worse. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry about claiming you as my wife. I thought it might be safer. Nora nodded, understanding his reasoning. It was quick thinking. I didn't mind. They stood in silence for a moment, both aware that the encounter had changed something between them, created a shared secret, a moment of alliance against potential danger. I don't think you should head to Jackson today, Zach said finally. Not with those three on the trail ahead. Give them time to move on. Concern for her safety warred with her desire to continue her journey, but Nora saw the wisdom in his suggestion. One more night then, she agreed. The afternoon passed quietly as they completed the remaining chores, but Nora noticed that Zach frequently paused to scan the horizon, and he kept his rifle closer than usual. His protectiveness stirred something in her, a feeling of security she hadn't experienced in a long time. That evening, as they prepared supper together, Zach asked the question that had clearly been on his mind. What are you running from, Nora? Really? She stilled, a potato half peeled in her hand. The direct question deserved an honest answer, she decided. My late brother's business partner, she said, keeping her eyes on her task. Elliot Blackfield. After Timothy died, Elliot took control of their shipping company. My brother had left his share to me, but Elliot manipulated the situation. Claimed Timothy had gambling debts that needed to be settled. Zach listened intently, his expression darkening as she continued. He offered me a choice: marry him and keep a portion of the business, or lose everything. When I refused, things became unpleasant. He had influence with the authorities, with the banks. Suddenly, I couldn't access my accounts. Rumors began spreading about my character. So you left, Zach concluded. Nora nodded, meeting his eyes at last. I sold my mother's jewelry, took what cash I could gather, and headed west, I thought. If I could get far enough away, start new somewhere no one knew me, I could build a life on my own terms. Zach's jaw tightened. This Blackfield, he's not the type to let things go, is he? No, she admitted, he's not. But I've covered my tracks as best I could. St. Louis is a long way from Wyoming Territory. Yes, it is, he agreed, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Well, you're safe here for now, and when you're ready to move on, I'll make sure you get to Jackson safely. His words were both reassuring and oddly disappointing. Nora had grown comfortable in Zach's cabin in his company. The prospect of continuing her journey alone suddenly seemed less appealing than it had 2 days ago. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. He smiled, the warmth of it reaching his eyes. It's nothing you haven't earned with your help around here. Speaking of which, he reached into a trunk near the bed and pulled out a small leather-bound book. I've been meaning to update my ledgers with the new calves born this season. Since you're good with numbers, maybe you could help me make sense of these figures. Nora recognized the gesture for what it was: an effort to make her feel useful, to treat her as a capable equal rather than a charity case. She accepted the book gratefully, and they spent the evening by the fire, heads bent together over the simple accounting of a small but growing ranch. As Nora helped organize Zach's records, she found herself impressed by what he had accomplished. Starting with almost nothing, he had built a viable operation through hard work and careful planning. His notations were precise, his strategy for expansion methodical. This was no impulsive dreamer, but a man with vision and the determination to realize it. You're going to need more grazing land if you continue expanding at this rate, she observed, showing him the projections she had calculated. And possibly another hand to help with the larger herd. Zach studied her figures with respect. You've got a good head for business, Nora. I've been thinking the same thing about the land. There's a parcel to the north that might come available next spring. Their conversation drifted from ranch business to broader topics, books they had read, places they had seen, their hopes for the future. Nora found herself laughing more than she had in months, drawn out of her shell by Zach's quiet humor and genuine interest in her thoughts. When she finally retired to the bed, leaving Zach to his place by the fire, Nora lay awake longer than usual, her mind turning over the events of the past few days. She had arrived a stranger, expecting a single night's shelter. Now, 3 days later, she felt a connection to this place and its owner that defied rational explanation. It's gratitude, she told herself firmly. Gratitude and the natural bond that forms between people who face potential danger together. Nothing more. But as sleep claimed her, Nora couldn't help but wonder what might happen if she stayed just a little longer. The next morning, Nora awoke to the sound of voices outside the cabin. She dressed quickly, heart racing as she recognized one of the speakers as Hank, the leader of the riders from the previous day. When she opened the door, she found Zach standing in the yard, his posture tense as he faced Hank and his companions, who remained mounted on their horses. "Like I said, we're just passing back through," Hank was saying, his tone less friendly than before. "Thought we'd check if you'd reconsidered our offer." "And like I told you," Zach replied firmly, "my cattle aren't for sale, especially not at the price you're offering." Nora moved to stand beside him, sensing that her presence might help to escalate the situation. Hank's eyes flicked to her, then back to Zach. "Your wife convinced you to hold out for more, is that it?" He chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. "That's a shame. We're reasonable men, but our patience has limits." The threat was thinly veiled, and Nora felt Zach stiffen beside her. "I think you'd best move on," he said, his hand resting near his pistol. "There's nothing for you here." Boyd, the youngest rider, spat on the ground. "There's 20 head of prime cattle by my count. Wouldn't take much to drive them off while you're sleeping." "You're welcome to try," Zach replied coldly, "but I sleep light and I'm a fair shot even in the dark." The tension stretched between them, broken only when Wesley, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "Come on, Hank. Plenty other ranches between here and Cheyenne. No need to fixate on this one." Hank considered for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Your lucky day, Vaughn." "But luck has a way of running out in these parts." His gaze lingered on Nora. "You take care now, Mrs. Vaughn. Shame if anything were to happen to a pretty lady like yourself." With that, the riders turned their horses and departed, moving at a deliberately unhurried pace, as if to emphasize that they were leaving by choice rather than necessity. Once they were out of earshot, Nora turned to Zach. "What was that about? What offer?" Zach's expression was grim. "They came by earlier while you were still asleep. Offered to buy my entire herd for a fraction of its worth. When I refused, they started asking questions about neighboring ranches, especially the Harrison place up north." "Rustlers, then," Nora concluded, "or worse," Zach agreed. "The type who don't mind adding a little intimidation or violence to get what they want." He looked at her with concern. "You definitely can't head to Jackson today, not with them out there." Nora nodded, her earlier eagerness to continue her journey completely extinguished by the threat Hank and his men posed. "What do we do?" Zach considered for a moment. "I'll ride over to the Harrison Ranch, warn Thomas about those three, maybe stop by the Miller place on the way back." "We need to get word out." He glanced at the sky. "If I leave now, I can be back before dark. And leave me here alone." Nora couldn't keep the alarm from her voice, his expression softened. "I don't like it either, but someone needs to warn the neighbors. You'll be safer here than on the trail." He hesitated, then added, "I'll show you where I keep my spare revolver before I go." The idea of being left alone with only a gun she barely knew how to use was far from comforting, but Nora recognized the necessity of warning the other ranchers. She straightened her shoulders, determined not to appear weak. "I'll be fine, just be careful." After a quick breakfast, Zach prepared to depart, saddling his sturdy gelding and loading his rifle. Before mounting up, He showed Nora how to use the revolver, a Colt .45 that felt heavy and awkward in her hands, and instructed her to bar the door after he left. "I'll knock 4 times when I return," he told her, his blue eyes serious as they held hers. "Don't open for anyone else, no matter what they say." Nora nodded, fighting the urge to ask him to stay. "I understand. Please be careful, Zach," he smiled, reaching out to briefly squeeze her hand. "Always am. I'll be back before you know it." As she watched him ride away, Nora was struck by the realization that she cared deeply about his safe return, more deeply than she should for a man she had known just 3 days. The hours of Zach's absence crept by with excruciating slowness. Nora kept herself busy cleaning the cabin, organizing his supplies, and checking periodically through the windows for any sign of movement. She kept the revolver within reach at all times, though the weight and deadliness of it made her uncomfortable. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising another storm. Nora paced the small cabin, worry gnawing at her as she calculated how long it should take Zach to reach the neighboring ranches and return. He should have been back by now, unless something had delayed him or worse. As the first snowflakes began to fall, she heard the sound of approaching hooves. Relief surged through her, quickly followed by caution as she remembered Zach's warning. Peering through the window, her heart sank when she saw not Zach but Hank and his companions, riding slowly toward the cabin. Nora grabbed the revolver, her hands trembling slightly as she checked that it was loaded just as Zach had shown her. She positioned herself away from the windows, listening as the men dismounted outside. "Mrs. Vaughn," Hank's voice called. "We noticed your husband riding toward the Harrison place earlier. Thought you might be in need of company with a storm coming." Nora remained silent, praying they would believe the cabin empty and move on. "We know you're in there, madam," Boyd called, his tone less friendly. "Best come out and talk to us civilized-like." The sound of boots on the porch made Nora's heart race. She gripped the revolver tighter, pointing it toward the door. "Your husband's been delayed," Hank said, his voice closer now. "Ran into some trouble on the trail, asked us to come check on you." It was an obvious lie. Zach would never send these men to her, but the implication that he might be in danger sent a chill through Nora that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. "If you don't open up," Wesley added, "we might just have to break this door down." "For your own safety, of course." Nora took a deep breath, steadying her resolve. "I'm armed," she called out, proud that her voice remained steady. "My husband taught me to shoot, and I won't hesitate if you try to enter this cabin." There was a moment of silence, then low laughter. "Hear that, boys? The little lady's got a gun." Hank's voice hardened. "Listen here, Mrs. Vaughn, we're taking those cattle one way or another. You can make this easy or hard on yourself." The door handle rattled as someone tested it, finding it securely barred. Nora aimed the revolver at the center of the door, her finger resting lightly on the trigger as Zach had shown her. "Your husband isn't coming back," Hank called, his tone turning nasty. "Not today, maybe not ever. You're all alone out here with a storm coming. Be reasonable." Fear clutched at Nora's heart, fear for herself, but even more for Zach. Had they harmed him? Delayed him somehow? Or was it just another lie to frighten her into compliance? The sound of breaking glass shattered her thoughts as a window pane near the door exploded inward. A gloved hand reached through the opening, feeling for the bar that secured the door. Without hesitation, Nora fired the revolver. The sound was deafening in the small cabin, the recoil nearly causing her to drop the weapon. A howl of pain followed as the hand withdrew quickly, accompanied by a stream of curses. "You shot me." Boyd's voice was high with pain and disbelief. "The bitch shot me." "Get back," Hank ordered. "We need to think this through." Nora used the moment to reposition herself, moving to a spot where she could see both the door and the damaged window. Her hands were shaking, but a fierce determination had taken hold of her. She would not be their victim. Outside, she could hear the men arguing in harsh whispers. The snow was falling more heavily now, the wind picking up as the storm intensified. If Zach was still out there somewhere, he would be facing increasingly hazardous conditions. "Last chance, Mrs. Vaughn," Hank called after several minutes. "Open the door and we'll just take the cattle. No harm will come to you." "I don't believe you," Nora replied clearly, "and I have plenty of ammunition." The standoff continued as the afternoon waned into early evening, the cabin growing darker as the storm clouds blocked what remained of the daylight. Nora lit a lamp, keeping it away from the windows to avoid creating a target, and maintained her vigilant watch. Just as she was beginning to fear the men might wait until nightfall to make another attempt, she heard the sound of a rifle shot in the distance. Hank and his companions heard it too, their voices rising in alarm. "Someone's coming," Wesley said, loud enough for Nora to hear. "Mount up," Hank ordered. "We'll deal with this later." The sound of retreating hoofbeats filled Nora with cautious relief. Had Zach returned? Or was it someone else? Perhaps one of the neighboring ranchers he had gone to warn. She remained in her defensive position, the revolver ready, waiting for some sign of who had driven the rustlers away. Minutes later, the distinctive pattern of 4 knocks sounded on the door, followed by Zach's voice calling her name with shaking hands. Nora removed the bar and flung open the door to find Zach, snow-covered and grim-faced, his rifle in hand. Behind him stood another man, similarly armed and weather-beaten. "Thank God," Zach breathed, stepping forward to grasp her shoulders, his eyes quickly assessing her for injury. "Are you hurt?" Nora shook her head, sudden tears threatening as the tension of the past hours released its hold on her. "No, I'm fine, but they were here, Hank and the others. They tried to break in. I shot one of them in the hand." Pride flashed in Zach's eyes. "Good girl." He turned to his companion. "Thomas, this is Nora, Thomas Harrison from the North Ranch. He rode back with me when we saw fresh tracks heading this way." Thomas, a weathered man in his 40s, nodded respectfully. "Madam, looks like you held your own against those vermin." "They said you'd been delayed," Nora told Zach, unable to keep the worry from her voice. "That you might not be coming back at all." Zach's jaw tightened. "They tried to waylay us on our return, but they weren't expecting Thomas to be with me. We exchanged a few shots and they retreated." He glanced at the broken window, then back to Nora. "You're sure you're not hurt?" "I'm sure," she assured him, suddenly aware of how close he was standing, of the intensity in his gaze as he looked at her. Thomas cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Those 3 will be back and probably with reinforcements. They've been hitting ranches all across the territory. I've sent my boy to fetch the sheriff from Jackson, but it could be days before he arrives." Zach nodded grimly. "We'll need to be prepared." He turned to Nora. "This changes things. You can't travel to Jackson now, not until these men are caught." The prospect of remaining at the ranch under such dangerous circumstances should have terrified her, but instead, Nora felt a strange calm. Here, at least, she had allies Zach, who had already risked himself to protect her, and now Thomas Harrison and potentially other neighboring ranchers. "I understand," she said. "I'll do whatever I can to help." Thomas looked impressed by her resolve. "Your wife's got spirit, Vaughn." Zach glanced at Nora, a silent question in his eyes. She gave an imperceptible nod, understanding that maintaining the fiction of their marriage was safer for now. "That she does," he agreed, his voice softening as he looked at her. "That she certainly does." Thomas declined their invitation to stay the night, insisting he needed to return to his own ranch to prepare its defenses. After he departed, promising to spread word to other neighbors about the threat, Zach secured the cabin as best he could, boarding up the broken window and checking all possible entry points. As they worked together, Nora recounted the events of the afternoon in more detail, how the men had tried to frighten her into opening the door, and how she had fired when Boyd reached through the window. "You did everything right," Zach told her, pride evident in his voice. "Many would have panicked, but you kept your head." "I was terrified," she admitted, "but more angry than afraid, I think. The way they spoke, the things they implied about you being hurt." She trailed off, unable to express the depth of her fear for his safety. Zach paused in his work, turning to face her. "I'm sorry you had to face them alone. I shouldn't have left you." "You had to warn the others," she said firmly, "and I managed well enough." He smiled, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, the gentle gesture at odds with his calloused hands. "That you did, Nora Gallagher, that you most certainly did." The storm intensified as the evening progressed, howling around the cabin as if mirroring the danger that lurked beyond its walls. Zach and Nora shared a simple meal, both too keyed up from the day's events to have much appetite. Afterward, they sat by the fire, discussing their options. "Thomas thinks the sheriff might be here in 3 days if the weather improves," Zach explained. "In the meantime, we need to be vigilant. Hank and his gang won't give up easily, especially now that Boyd's been wounded. Will they come back tonight, do you think?" Nora asked, glancing toward the boarded window. Zach shook his head. "Not in this weather and not after taking fire from both of us. They'll regroup, maybe gather more men. We have some time." He studied her face in the firelight. "You should try to rest. I'll take first watch." Despite her exhaustion, Nora was reluctant to sleep, worried about leaving Zach to guard alone. "Wake me in a few hours," she insisted. "You need rest too." He agreed, though she suspected he might let her sleep through the night anyway. As she settled onto the bed, still fully clothed in case of trouble, Zach remained by the fire, his rifle across his knees, his posture alert despite the long day. "Zach," she called softly. He turned to look at her. "Yes, thank you for coming back, for everything." His expression softened. "Get some sleep, Nora. I'm not going anywhere." The simple promise comforted her more than it should have, and despite her anxiety, she found herself drifting into sleep, secure in the knowledge that Zach Vaughn was standing guard. The next 2 days passed in a state of watchful tension. The storm eventually subsided, leaving behind a landscape transformed by fresh snow. Zach and Nora maintained a constant vigilance, taking turns keeping watch while the other rested or tended to essential chores. They ventured outside only when necessary and always together, with weapons at the ready. Zach taught Nora more about handling the revolver, impressed by her determination to become proficient with it. "You're a natural," he remarked after she hit the makeshift target he had set up near the barn 3 times in succession. "Steady hands." "My father taught me a bit of target shooting when I was younger," she admitted, though he never imagined I'd need the skill for self-defense. As they worked side by side, facing the threat together, Nora found herself drawn ever more strongly to Zach. His quiet competence, his unwavering protective instinct, and his respect for her abilities combined to create an attraction more powerful than any she had experienced before. For his part, Zach seemed equally affected by their enforced proximity. She often caught him watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice, his blue eyes warm with admiration and something deeper she dared not name. On the evening of the second day, as they sat by the fire after their meal, Zach broached the subject that had been hovering unspoken between them. "What will you do when this is over, when the sheriff has dealt with Hank and his gang?" Nora looked up from the sock she was darning, one of Zach's, worn thin at the heel. "Continue to Jackson, I suppose, as planned." Zach nodded, his expression unreadable as he stared into the fire. "That makes sense." A silence stretched between them, filled with unasked questions and unspoken possibilities. Nora found herself unwilling to contemplate leaving this cabin, this man who had come to mean so much to her in such a short time. Unless. She began, then faltered, unsure how to express her conflicted feelings. Zach looked up sharply. "Unless," Nora took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Unless there were a reason to stay." The implications of her words hung in the air between them. Zach set aside the knife he had been sharpening and moved to sit beside her on the bench, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Would you want such a reason?" he asked quietly, his voice deeper than usual. Nora met his gaze directly, allowing her feelings to show in her eyes. "I think I might." Zach's hand found hers, his calloused fingers wrapping gently around her smaller ones. Nora, I know it's only been a few days and maybe it's just the danger making us feel things that aren't real, but… He paused, searching for words. I haven't felt this way about anyone before, the thought of you leaving. I feel it too, she whispered, her heart racing. I can't explain it, it defies all logic, but there's something here between us, something real. His free hand rose to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the strength she knew those hands possessed. Stay, he said simply. Not just until the danger passes. Stay with me, Nora. The earnestness in his eyes, the quiet certainty in his voice made her breath catch. This was no practiced declaration from a society suitor, but the honest request of a man who had shown his character through his actions rather than his words. It won't be easy, she cautioned, even as her heart soared at his invitation. I'm city-bred, I have much to learn about ranch life. You're a quick study, he countered with a smile, and I'm a patient teacher. People will talk. A woman arriving with no connections, staying with a bachelor. Let them talk. We know the truth of how we met, how we feel. Nora found herself running out of objections, not because they didn't exist, but because none of them seemed to matter when weighed against the prospect of building a life with this man. Ask me properly, she said softly. If you truly mean it, ask me properly. Understanding dawned in Zach's eyes. Slowly, he slid from the bench to one knee before her, still holding her hand in his. Nora Gallagher, he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. I know we've known each other only days, but I feel I've waited my whole life to find you. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Of building a life with me on this land? Tears pricked at Nora's eyes, not tears of sadness or fear, but of a joy so pure it almost hurt. Yes, she whispered, then more firmly, yes, Zachary Vaughn, I will marry you. His smile was like the sunrise, transforming his rugged features with a happiness so genuine it took her breath away. Rising from his knee, he drew her to her feet and into his arms, one hand cradling the back of her head as he gazed down at her with wonder. May I kiss you, Nora Gallagher? My future wife. In answer, she rose on tiptoes, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened, expressing all the emotions that had grown between them in their short time together. Zach's arms tightened around her, pulling her closer as if he feared she might disappear, while Nora's hands found their way to his shoulders, then his hair, reveling in the solid reality of him. When they finally parted, both breathless, Zach rested his forehead against hers. I don't have a ring, he murmured apologetically. Nothing worthy of you. Nora smiled, her heart so full she thought it might burst. I don't need a ring, just your promise. You have that, he assured her fervently, and everything else I have to give. Their moment of joy was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats, several horses approaching at a gallop. Zach immediately tensed, reaching for his rifle even as he positioned himself between Nora and the door. Stay back, he instructed, all tenderness replaced by vigilant protectiveness. They waited, weapons ready, as the riders drew closer. Then a voice called out, unfamiliar but carrying authority. Vaughn, it's Sheriff Daniels from Jackson. Thomas Harrison sent me. Relief flooded through Nora as Zach moved to the window, cautiously peering out to confirm the identity of their visitors before lowering his rifle. It's the sheriff, all right, he told her. And it looks like he's brought a posse. Opening the door, they welcomed Sheriff Daniels, a weathered man in his 50s with a silver star pinned to his coat, and his deputies, grateful for the reinforcements against Hank's gang. Harrison told me what happened, the sheriff explained after introductions had been made. Said those rustlers threatened you and your wife, tried to break in. He looked at Nora with respect. Also said the missus here put a bullet through one of their hands. Good shooting, madam. Nora exchanged a glance with Zach, deciding there was no need to correct the assumption about their relationship. Thank you, Sheriff. I was merely defending our home. The phrase our home felt right on her lips, as if she had always belonged here with Zach. Over coffee, Sheriff Daniels shared what he knew about Hank's gang, a notorious group responsible for cattle thefts across Wyoming and Montana territories, as well as several murders when ranchers had resisted. "We've been tracking them for months," he explained. "But they're slippery, always moving on before we can catch up. Thanks to your neighbors raising the alarm, we might finally have them cornered." The plan, he outlined, was to set up a watch around the ranch, using it as bait to draw Hank back. With the posse hidden and ready, they would catch the rustlers in the act. "It's risky," the sheriff admitted, "but it might be our best chance to end their spree once and for all." Zach looked to Nora, his expression making it clear that the decision would be theirs together. "What do you think?" She straightened her shoulders, determined to face the threat directly rather than living in fear. "I think it's time these men faced justice. We'll help however we can." The sheriff nodded approvingly. "Brave woman you've got, Vaughn." "I know," Zach replied softly, his eyes never leaving Nora's face. The trap was set that night, with deputies concealed in strategic positions around the property. Zach and Nora remained in the cabin, maintaining the appearance of a normal evening while staying alert for any sign of the rustlers' return. As the hours passed with no disturbance, Nora found herself fighting against drowsiness. Zach, noticing her struggle, insisted she lie down while he kept watch with the sheriff. "Rest while you can," he urged. "I'll wake you if anything happens." Reluctantly, she complied, stretching out on the bed fully clothed. Despite her intention to merely rest her eyes, she soon fell into a deep sleep, exhausted by the tension of the past days. She was awakened sometime later by Zach's hand on her shoulder, his voice low and urgent. "They're coming. Stay down and away from the windows." Fully alert in an instant, Nora grabbed the revolver from the bedside table and followed Zach's instructions, positioning herself where she would be protected yet able to defend herself if necessary. Through the cabin's walls, she could hear the muffled sounds of horses approaching, then men's voices, Hank's distinctive growl giving orders to his companions, now numbering at least 6 by Nora's count. "Remember," Hank was saying, "Vaughn and his woman are mine. The rest of you focus on the cattle." The cold calculation in his voice sent a shiver down Nora's spine. This was personal for him now, a matter of revenge as well as profit. Sheriff Daniels had positioned himself near the back of the cabin, ready to give the signal to his deputies when the rustlers fully committed to their raid. Zach stood by the front window, rifle ready, his face set in grim determination. The tension built as Hank's men began moving toward the barn and corral, clearly intending to take the cattle first before dealing with the cabin's occupants. Nora held her breath, waiting for the sheriff's signal, when suddenly a shot rang out, one of the deputies firing prematurely, perhaps spotted by the rustlers. Chaos erupted as Hank's men realized the trap. Gunfire exploded from multiple directions, bullets thudding into the cabin walls as the rustlers sought cover. "Stay down," Zach shouted to Nora as he returned fire through the window. Sheriff Daniels burst through the back door, positioning himself at another window to join the fight. "They're surrounded," he called. "They won't get far." The gunfight seemed to last an eternity, though in reality it was over in minutes. When the shooting finally stopped, an eerie silence fell, broken only by the moans of wounded men and the sheriff calling for the rustlers to surrender. "It's over, Hank. Throw down your weapons." Through the window, Nora could see several figures with hands raised, being disarmed by the deputies. But Hank himself was nowhere in sight. A floorboard creaked behind her, the only warning before the back door burst open, revealing Hank, his face contorted with fury, a revolver in his hand. "You," he snarled, focusing on Nora. "You and your husband cost me everything." Time seemed to slow as he raised his weapon. Nora's body reacted before her mind could process the danger, her arm lifting, fingers squeezing the trigger of her own revolver. The sound was deafening in the confined space. Hank staggered, a look of surprise replacing the rage on his face as he clutched his chest. He took one step forward, then collapsed to the floor, Zach was at her side in an instant, kicking away Hank's dropped weapon and pulling Nora into his arms, shielding her from the sight of the fallen rustler. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands running over her as if to assure himself she was whole. Nora shook her head, her body beginning to tremble as the reality of what had just occurred sank in. "I shot him," she whispered. "I killed a man." "You saved your own life," Sheriff Daniels corrected, kneeling to check Hank for signs of life and finding none. "Maybe all our lives." He was a desperate man with nothing to lose. Zach held her tighter, his voice low and fierce in her ear. "You did what you had to do, Nora, just like before. You protected yourself, protected us." The logic of their words did little to ease the shock of taking a life, but Nora drew strength from Zach's solid presence, focusing on his heartbeat against her cheek rather than the still form on the floor. Outside, the deputies had secured the remaining rustlers. Boyd, his hand still bandaged from Nora's earlier shot, spat curses as he was led away, while the others, seeing their leader fallen, surrendered without further resistance. "We'll take them to Jackson for trial," Sheriff Daniels explained as his men removed Hank's body from the cabin. "They'll face justice for their crimes: cattle rustling, attempted murder, actual murder in some cases." He nodded respectfully to Nora. "Your testimony will be needed, madam, but not for a while yet. The territorial court only convenes every few months." "We'll be there," Zach assured him, his arm still protectively around Nora's shoulders. After the sheriff and his posse departed with their prisoners, the sudden silence in the cabin felt almost oppressive. Zach moved to clean up the glass from a shattered window, while Nora mechanically prepared coffee, both of them seeking refuge in routine tasks. When they finally sat down together at the table, the events of the night caught up with Nora. Her hands began to shake so violently that she couldn't lift her coffee cup. Tears welled in her eyes as the accumulated stress, fear, and shock overwhelmed her. Without a word, Zach rose and moved to her side, gathering her in his arms and lifting her as easily as if she weighed nothing. He carried her to the bed, sitting down with her cradled in his lap, and simply held her while she wept. "It's over now," he murmured against her hair. "You're safe." "We're safe." "I've never been so frightened," she confessed between sobs. "Not for myself, but for you. When I heard the shooting start, all I could think was that I couldn't bear to lose you." His arms tightened around her. "You won't lose me, Nora, I promise you that." Gradually, her tears subsided, leaving her drained but oddly cleansed, as if the emotional release had washed away some of the horror of the night. Zach wiped the moisture from her cheeks with gentle thumbs. "You should rest now. Real rest without fear." Nora nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. But as he made to rise and leave her to sleep, she caught his hand. "Stay with me, just to hold me." The request was improper. They weren't yet married, after all, but after what they had faced together, conventional proprieties seemed absurd. Zach hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'll stay as long as you need me." He removed only his boots before stretching out beside her on the narrow bed, drawing her into the circle of his arms. Nora rested her head on his chest, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and the solid warmth of his body next to hers. "Sleep," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I've got you." Secure in his embrace, Nora finally surrendered to exhaustion, drifting into a deep, dreamless sleep. The days following the confrontation with the rustlers brought a gradual return to normalcy. Zach and Nora fell into a routine of shared work and companionship, their bond strengthening with each passing day. The fiction of their marriage, maintained for safety during the crisis, gave way to the anticipation of their real union. News of their engagement spread quickly among the neighboring ranchers, who had come to respect Nora for her courage during the rustler incident. Thomas Harrison's wife, Martha, rode over with fabric for a wedding dress and offers of assistance with the preparations. "It's about time Zach found himself a good woman," she declared, measuring Nora for the gown. "That man's been alone too long. Needs someone to remind him there's more to life than cattle and crops." Nora smiled, watching through the window as Zach mended a fence, his movements sure and efficient. "He gives me so much more than I give him." Martha followed her gaze, her expression knowing. "Don't sell yourself short, dear. I've never seen that man smile so much as he has since you arrived." The wedding was set for mid-December, a month after Nora's arrival at the ranch. Reverend Collins from Jackson agreed to make the journey to perform the ceremony, and neighbors from miles around promised to attend, eager for any excuse to gather and celebrate as winter settled over the territory. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Nora threw herself into learning everything she could about ranch life. Zach proved a patient teacher, showing her how to care for the cattle, manage the accounts, and perform the countless tasks necessary to keep the operation running smoothly. "You're a natural at this," he remarked one evening as they reviewed the ledgers together. "We'll make a rancher of you yet." Nora smiled, leaning into his side. "I never imagined this life for myself, but now I can't picture any other." Their physical relationship remained chaste, limited to kisses and embraces, both of them honoring the commitment they had made to wait until their wedding night. But the anticipation of that union added a sweet tension to their interactions, a promise of deeper intimacy to come. 1 week before the wedding, a letter arrived from Jackson forwarded from St. Louis by a lawyer Nora had contacted before her departure. The contents confirmed what she had suspected. Elliot Blackfield had indeed attempted to manipulate her brother's will, but his schemes had been discovered by the authorities. He now faced charges of fraud and embezzlement. "You were right to leave when you did," Zach said after she shared the news. "Men like that are dangerous when cornered." Nora nodded, a weight lifting from her shoulders. "I don't regret it. If I had stayed, I might never have found my way here. To you." He drew her close, his kiss conveying all the love and promise that words couldn't express. "Then I'm grateful for Blackfield's villainy. It brought me the greatest gift of my life." Their wedding day dawned clear and cold, the Wyoming landscape transformed into a winter wonderland beneath a blanket of fresh snow. Martha Harrison arrived early to help Nora dress in the simple but elegant gown they had created together, cream-colored wool with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. "You look beautiful," Martha declared, arranging a crown of evergreen and dried berries on Nora's auburn hair. Zach won't know what hit him. Thomas had taken Zach to his ranch to prepare, honoring the tradition that the groom shouldn't see his bride before the ceremony. By midday, neighbors began arriving, filling the small cabin with warmth and conversation as they awaited the proceedings. The ceremony itself was held outside, despite the cold, to accommodate the 30 or so guests who had traveled from surrounding ranches. Reverend Collins stood before a simple arch decorated with pine boughs, while the guests formed a semicircle around the space where vows would be exchanged. Nora's heart raced as Thomas escorted her from the cabin to where Zach waited. Her groom stood tall and proud in his best clothes, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion, his blue eyes filled with wonder as they fell upon her. The Reverend's words seemed to fade into the background as Nora focused on Zach's face, on the love and commitment she saw there. When the time came to speak their vows, her voice rang clear and true across the snow-covered yard. "I, Nora Gallagher, take you, Zachary Vaughn, to be my lawfully wedded husband. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." Zach's hands tightened around hers as he repeated the same vows, his deep voice steady with conviction. When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled guests seemed to echo across the vast Wyoming sky. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music and dancing in the cleared space of the barn, and a feast contributed by every family in attendance. Nora found herself passed from partner to partner as the neighbors welcomed her into their community, while Zach watched with pride, his eyes rarely leaving his new wife. As the hour grew late and guests began to depart for their own homes, Zach and Nora stood arm in arm at the door of their cabin, accepting final congratulations and well wishes. "You did well, son," Thomas Harrison said, clapping Zach on the shoulder. "She's a fine woman." "The finest," Zach agreed, his arm tightening around Nora's waist. When the last guest had ridden away, Zach turned to his bride with a mixture of tenderness and desire in his eyes. "Mrs. Vaughn," he said softly, the new name a caress on his lips. Nora smiled up at him, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had given her shelter when she needed it most, and now offered her a lifetime of love in return. "Mr. Vaughn," she replied, rising on tiptoes to meet his kiss. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold of the cabin, their home, their future. As the door closed behind them, shutting out the cold Wyoming night, Nora knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged. In the months that followed, Zach and Nora settled into married life with a joy that made even the most mundane tasks seem meaningful. Winter gave way to spring, bringing new calves to the herd and fresh possibilities to the ranch. True to his word, Zach purchased the northern parcel of land when it became available, expanding their operation and their prospects. Nora proved herself not just a competent ranch wife, but a true partner in the business, her head for figures and organization complementing Zach's practical knowledge of cattle and land management. They traveled to Jackson in early summer for the trial of the surviving rustlers, where Nora's testimony helped secure convictions and lengthy prison sentences. The journey also allowed them to establish connections with merchants in town, setting up regular supply arrangements and exploring potential markets for their growing herd. By their first anniversary, the ranch had prospered beyond Zach's most optimistic predictions. They had hired a hand to help with the expanded operation, a young man named Will, who had drifted west seeking opportunity, and found a place in their growing enterprise. And Nora had news of her own to share as they celebrated that milestone, cuddled before the fire in the cabin that had become so dear to them both. "I have an anniversary gift for you," she told Zach, taking his hand and placing it gently on her still flat stomach. "But it won't arrive for about 7 more months." The wonder that bloomed on his face was a sight she knew she would treasure forever. "A baby," he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make the miracle disappear. "We're having a baby," Nora nodded, tears of joy shining in her eyes. "Dr. Wilson confirmed it when we were in Jackson last week. He says everything looks healthy." Zach gathered her in his arms with a gentleness that belied his strength, pressing reverent kisses to her face, her hair, her lips. "I never thought I could be this happy," he confessed. "When you stumbled into my life that stormy night, I had no idea you were bringing me everything I never knew I wanted. And I never imagined that finding shelter for one night would lead to a lifetime of love," Nora replied, her arms twining around his neck. "But I wouldn't change a single moment of our journey." They built an addition to the cabin that winter, preparing for the baby's arrival with the same thoroughness they applied to all their endeavors. Neighbors offered advice, hand-me-down cradles and tiny garments, the community embracing the coming new life with typical frontier generosity. On a bright June morning in 1875, Nora gave birth to a son, a robust, healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and a shock of dark hair. They named him Timothy Samuel Vaughn, honoring both Nora's brother and Zach's father. As she watched Zach hold their son for the first time, his strong hands cradling the tiny form with infinite tenderness, Nora felt a completeness she had never known possible. The journey that had begun in fear and desperation had led her to this moment of perfect joy, to a family and a home built on love and mutual respect. Over the years, the Vaughn Ranch continued to flourish, expanding in both size and prosperity. 2 more children joined the family, a daughter, Lily, born in 1877, and another son, James, in 1880. The original cabin grew into a proper house, with multiple rooms and a wide porch where the family gathered on summer evenings to watch the sunset over the Wyoming hills. Through blizzards and droughts, through the challenges and triumphs that came with taming the frontier, Zach and Nora's partnership remained strong, their love deepening with each passing season. They weathered the hardships together and celebrated the victories, each day affirming the decision they had made to build a life with each other. By the turn of the century, the Vaughn Ranch was one of the most successful operations in the territory, now the state of Wyoming. Timothy, grown into a fine young man with his mother's quick mind and his father's steadfast nature, had taken on increasing responsibility for the ranch operations, allowing Zach and Nora more time to enjoy the fruits of their decades of labor. On the 27th anniversary of the night Nora had first arrived at the cabin, Zach surprised her with a gift, a small silver locket containing miniature portraits of their children and grandchildren. "For the woman who gave me a lifetime of love," he said as he fastened it around her neck, his hands still strong but gentler with the passing years. Starting with a single night of shelter. Nora touched the locket, then reached up to caress his face, lined now with the evidence of years lived fully in sun and wind, but still handsome to her eyes. "The best decision I ever made was knocking on your door, Zachary Vaughn. And the best decision I ever made was opening it, Nora Gallagher Vaughn." As they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where they had once exchanged wedding vows, Nora reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a desperate young woman fleeing her past to the matriarch of a thriving family and ranch, her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined on that stormy November evening so many years ago. The struggling rancher who had given her shelter for one night had indeed received a lifetime of love in return, but what she had gained was beyond measure: a home, a family, a purpose, and a love that had only grown stronger with each passing year. As the sun set over the Wyoming landscape they both cherished, Zach drew her close, pressing a kiss to her temple with the same tenderness he had shown since their earliest days together. "Thank you," he whispered, the words simple but filled with a lifetime of meaning. "For what?" she asked, though she knew the answer in her heart. His smile, still able to quicken her pulse after all these years, was her reply. "For everything, for staying, for building this life with me, for loving me." Nora leaned into his embrace, content in the knowledge that the shelter they had created together was strong enough to weather any storm, built on a foundation of love that had begun with a single night of kindness and grown into a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. "Always," she promised, the word encompassing their past, their present, and the future that stretched before them, a future they would continue to face together, as they had from the moment their paths had crossed on that fateful Wyoming night.